Tonight, the story moves the way candlelight moves across a quiet room, slowly, without urgency, allowing shadows to soften before they fade. I am thinking of a love that never needed to raise its voice. A love that learned how to exist inside careful sentences, inside pauses between lines, inside the gentle courage of writing what could not easily be spoken aloud. I remember a time when words carried weight simply by being written. When paper held the warmth of the hands that touched it, and ink seemed almost alive, dark at first, then settling into the fibers, becoming permanent in a way spoken words rarely were. In those days, a letter could hold an entire life inside it. A hope. A doubt. A question asked quietly, so quietly it might only be heard by the person meant to receive it. This is where my memory begins. Not with a meeting, not with a declaration, but with distance. With two houses, separate routines, separate expectations, and the long space between them that writing slowly began to cross. I did not yet know what that crossing would cost me, or what it would give back. I only knew that something unnamed had begun to take shape, line by line, as if the ink itself had decided to speak more softly than the world around us ever allowed. Before the story drifts any farther, I pause to offer a small, gentle invitation, the way one might speak quietly while drawing a curtain closed. If this story feels comforting to you, you may like or subscribe so you can return to these calm nights again. And if you wish, you can tell me where you are listening from, and whether the hour around you is early evening or already deep into night. There is no urgency in the asking. It is only an opening, left there softly. The night itself feels patient, as though it has released all other obligations. The air settles into stillness the way a blanket settles over the body, first light, then certain, then familiar enough that the mind stops noticing the weight of it. Somewhere nearby, a clock keeps time without insisting on it. The sound is not sharp or demanding. It is a soft reassurance, a reminder that minutes can pass without requiring attention, without asking to be filled. I allow the room around me to become simple. Lights are turned low, not extinguished, only dimmed to a kinder level. Corners of the ceiling soften. Furniture loses its sharp outlines and becomes suggestion instead of structure. The world does not disappear, it merely grows quieter, as if it has stepped back respectfully to allow rest more space. Even the walls seem to listen rather than speak. Thoughts that usually arrive with urgency begin to slow. They appear one at a time, like footsteps moving carefully across a carpeted floor. There is room between them now. Space enough to let one thought finish before the next begins. I do not try to control them. I let them pass as they wish, trusting that stillness will arrive on its own. In this memory, there is paper beneath my fingertips, slightly rough, with a texture that suggests patience and durability. It feels made to last, made to hold ink without bleeding into blur. I imagine the faint resistance beneath my hand as it moves, the way the surface seems to acknowledge each word. The paper is cool at first, then warms as it is touched, as if it remembers. A desk sits nearby, orderly not from perfection but from habit. A pen rests where it was last placed. A small tray holds sealing wax in muted colors. A folded sheet waits quietly, like a breath held without strain. Everything has a place, and nothing feels rushed to be used. The tools of writing seem quieter than spoken conversation ever could be. A pen returning to its stand makes a sound that feels polite, careful not to disturb the sleeping house. Wax warms and softens, then cools into a seal that feels final without being severe. Even folding a letter has a rhythm to it, slow and practiced, like smoothing linens or closing shutters at dusk. I listen for the spaces between things. The pause after a sentence. The moment before a name is written. The stillness after the ink dries, when the page no longer shines and the words look settled, as if they have decided to remain exactly where they are. This world asks for steadiness. It suggests there is time enough to be careful, time enough to choose words that do not bruise, time enough to let meaning soften before it reaches another heart. Nothing needs to be proved here. Nothing needs to be hurried. As I settle into that steadiness, my body follows. Shoulders lower without instruction. Jaw loosens. Breath lengthens naturally, unmeasured. It is enough, for now, to be here, inside a night that does not hurry, inside a story that moves the way candlelight moves, steady and warm, offering quiet illumination and nothing more. The year, as I remember it, was 1847. I did not think of it then as a number fixed in history, only as the present moment unfolding one careful day at a time. The place was Savannah, Georgia, a city that seemed to breathe differently at night, as if it understood the value of slowness. Even in winter, the evenings held warmth, a gentle persistence of heat that lingered after sunset and softened the edges of the dark. Salt from the nearby sea lived quietly in the air. It clung to skin and fabric without announcing itself, unnoticed at first, then suddenly recognizable, like a memory surfacing without effort. Gas lamps lined the brick streets, their glow neither bright nor dim, but steady enough to guide footsteps without startling them. Horse hooves passed with a muted rhythm over cobblestones, a sound that arrived, lingered briefly, and then faded, leaving silence intact once more. Wrought iron balconies traced dark patterns against pale buildings, their curves holding shadows like lace laid carefully across stone. In courtyards tucked between houses, jasmine climbed patiently along fences and walls, releasing a scent that felt almost drowsy, especially after nightfall. It was the kind of fragrance that did not demand attention, yet altered the air completely once it was noticed. The river was always there, shaping the city without asking permission. It moved slowly, wide and dark, carrying boats, cargo, and quiet commerce. By day it reflected sky and labor, but by night it became something more inward, more reflective, as if it were thinking. I often felt that the river understood waiting better than anyone. It never seemed in a hurry, yet it never truly stopped. Houses stood close enough to one another to suggest community, yet far enough apart to protect privacy. Windows glowed softly in the evenings, some lit for reading, some for conversation, some simply to hold back the dark. Curtains were drawn and opened according to habit rather than mood. Doors were closed with care, not suspicion, as if the night itself were trusted. Savannah had a way of layering sound. In the distance, there might be music from a gathering, faint and polite, drifting only as far as it was welcome. Somewhere nearer, a voice calling a name, then laughter quickly restrained. Closer still, the simple sounds of domestic life, cutlery set down. A chair moved, a step taken along a hallway that knew those footsteps well. Time moved differently there. Days were shaped by light and heat more than by clocks. Mornings unfolded gently, beginning not with urgency but with gradual awareness. Afternoons stretched long and unhurried, softened by shade and slow conversation. Evenings arrived like a familiar guest, never surprising, always expected. Night did not rush people indoors. Invited them to linger on porches, to sit beneath open windows, to speak a little longer before parting. Darkness felt companionable rather than enclosing. It held the city together, wrapping streets, houses, and gardens in the same quiet presence. I lived within these rhythms without questioning them. They felt permanent then, as though they had always existed and always would. I could not have said what would change, only that something within this particular year, within this particular place, was preparing to shift, quietly, without announcement, like ink touching paper for the first time. Life in Savannah moved according to patterns so familiar that most people no longer noticed them. I noticed them because they formed the shape of my days, outlining where I could go, how long I could stay, and what was expected of me when I arrived. Invitations were written carefully and answered with equal care. Visits were timed so precisely they felt almost choreographed. A woman's reputation was treated like fragile glass, admired from a distance and handled only with caution. A man's name, by contrast, was treated like a coin, polished often, spent where it mattered, and displayed whenever possible. Mornings began quietly, without drama or surprise. Bread arrived warm from the kitchen, wrapped in cloth to keep its heat. Windows were open just enough to let in air without inviting the full brightness of the day. Clothing was chosen not for comfort alone, but for what it suggested about character. Errands were arranged with deliberate manners, each stop planned so that nothing appeared careless or rushed. Messages were delivered by hand, and replies were expected within an appropriate interval, neither too eager nor too delayed. Afternoons belonged to shade. Porches became small sanctuaries where conversation unfolded at an unhurried pace. Words were chosen politely, sometimes too politely, circling endlessly around what was actually meant. Tea cooled in cups while people spoke of weather, of family, of acquaintances whose lives were discussed as if they were public property. I learned early how much could be communicated through tone alone, through pauses, through the careful avoidance of certain subjects. Evenings brought gatherings that followed an expected rhythm. Charity events, musicales, dinners arranged weeks in advance. Rooms filled with candlelight and low voices. Music drifted politely through open doors. Smiles appeared easily, but not always honestly. I became familiar with the subtle language of glances, with the way a raised brow or a brief silence could carry judgment more efficiently than words ever could. Above everything rested an unspoken agreement that people would behave as they were supposed to behave, and want what they were supposed to want. Desire, when it strayed beyond expectation, was treated as something to be corrected rather than understood. Individuality was admired only when it did not disrupt order, when it could be displayed briefly and then returned to its proper place. I felt these expectations most clearly when they brushed against my own choices. When I lingered too long over a book instead of conversation. When I listened more than I spoke. When I failed to show the urgency others expected me to feel about marriage, as though affection were a timetable rather than an experience. Questions were asked gently, but repeatedly, until their meaning was impossible to miss, yet even within these structures, there were small freedoms. A walk taken alone in the early evening, when the streets were quiet. A letter read twice instead of once, held longer than necessary. A thought kept private, untouched by opinion or advice. Ordinary life was not cruel. It was simply firm in its belief that it knew best. At the time, I accepted this world as it was. I did not yet understand how much of my attention had been trained outward, toward appearances and approval. I only knew the rhythm of days, the careful choreography of manners, and the quiet sense that something within me was listening patiently for a different kind of permission. Within this ordered world, lives moved in gentle orbits, crossing and separating according to habit more than intention. I was aware of these lives not because they were dramatic, but because they pressed quietly against my own, shaping it in small, persistent ways. I lived with my father in a house that carried the soft, familiar sense of lemon polish and old books. He was a practical man, quiet in his opinions, attentive without being intrusive. He watched more than he commented, as though he understood that some truths arrived only when left undisturbed. Our conversations were steady, unadorned, and built on a shared respect for silence. He did not ask me to explain myself, and for that I was grateful. Around us moved relatives who meant well and neighbors who believed observation was a form of care. An aunt spoke of marriage as if it were a necessary transaction, something to be arranged carefully and completed before opportunity expired. Friends offered reassurance that time remained, though their voices often carried a note of concern beneath the kindness. Gossip traveled lightly, passed along with smiles, collected the way others collected embroidery thread, to be admired and compared. And then there was Nathaniel Brooks. I knew of him before I truly knew him. As one often does in a city that speaks quietly but remembers everything. He had money, standing, and an education that taught him elegance long before it taught him tenderness. He moved easily through social spaces, practiced in courtesy, trained to believe the world functioned in a single, reliable direction. He was not unkind. He was simply certain, and certainty was rewarded. When we were first introduced, nothing remarkable occurred. There was conversation that followed expectation, pleasantries exchanged with ease. Yet even then, I sensed the careful structure of his manner, the way emotion seemed measured before it was allowed to surface. He spoke with confidence, and people listened because that was what they had been taught to do. I did not yet know how closely our paths would begin to draw together, or how quietly. At that time, he was simply another presence within the larger pattern of the city, another life shaped by rules he did not question. I was aware of him only as one becomes aware of a change in air, subtle but persistent. Looking back, I see how naturally these lives align themselves. My father's quiet observation. Nathaniel's learned restraint. The surrounding voices that spoke in the language of should and ought. None of it felt deliberate. It was simply the arrangement we were all given, the stage set before any of us realized a different story might be possible. At the time, I did not name what I was noticing. I only felt a slight shift, a sense that certain encounters carried more weight than others, even when nothing outward had changed. People remained themselves. Conversations remained polite. Yet something had begun to arrange itself beneath the surface, patient and unnoticed, waiting for the moment it would make itself known. The pressure of that world was rarely spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It lived in the corners of rooms, in the careful phrasing of compliments, in the way approval was offered with conditions quietly attached. It was breathed in with the air, absorbed without ceremony, and carried long before one realized it had weight. No single moment announced it, yet it was always present, steady and persistent. I heard it when I was praised for being agreeable, as if agreement were the highest form of virtue a woman could achieve. I noticed it when my composure was admired more readily than my thoughts, when calmness was mistaken for contentment. There was comfort in being considered pleasant, but there was also a narrowing, a sense that too much honesty might be mistaken for defiance, or worse, for ingratitude. Expectations did not demand obedience. They encouraged it, gently and persistently, until resistance felt impolite. For men, the pressure took a different shape. I observed it in the way certainty was celebrated, as though doubt were a flaw rather than a necessary step toward understanding. A man was expected to know his direction, to move forward without hesitation, to carry responsibility without showing the strain of it. Emotion, when acknowledged at all, was meant to be contained, disciplined, kept from interfering with decisions that affected reputation and standing. Strength was measured by how little one revealed. Nathaniel moved easily within those expectations, or appeared to. From the outside, he seemed well fitted to the role he had been given. His confidence was polished, his manners practiced, his words carefully aligned with what was admired. Yet there were moments, brief and easily missed, when the structure of his certainty showed hairline cracks. A pause held a second too long. A question answered more carefully than required. A look that lingered somewhere distant before returning to the present. I noticed these things not because I searched for them, but because they felt familiar. Neither of us was free of the rules that governed us. We simply resisted them in different ways. My resistance was quiet, expressed through attention and refusal rather than confrontation. I listened where others spoke over one another. I declined to perform enthusiasm where it was expected. I chose solitude when company felt compulsory, and silence when explanation would have required distortion. His resistance, I would later understand, lived in restraint taken too far, in feeling measured until it nearly disappeared. What the world praised in him was the very thing that limited him most. Control, admired as strength, had become a disguise he wore so often it threatened to replace what lay beneath. He had learned how to behave long before he learned how to be known. The weight of reality settled most heavily in moments of comparison. When age was mentioned with false sympathy, as though time were a judgment rather than a passage. When glances drifted toward my hand, searching for a ring that would resolve unspoken concern. When conversation stalled politely, waiting for a future everyone assumed would look the same for us all, yet within that wait, there was also a strange stillness. A sense that endurance itself created space. That by moving carefully, by refusing to rush toward what was prescribed, something else might eventually reveal itself. I did not yet know what that something would be. I only knew that the pressure, once noticed, could not be unnoticed. It remained there, steady and unyielding, shaping choices and shaping silences. And beneath it, quieter still, a different current moved, slow, patient, and persistent, waiting for the moment when restraint would finally give way to truth. Time did not change all at once. It loosened gradually, like a knot worked open by patient fingers. Days continued to follow one another with familiar rhythm, morning light, afternoon heat, the long easing of evening into night. Yet within that repetition, something subtle began to shift. A difference so small it might have been missed if I had not already learned to listen. Winter brought with it a charity fair held in a grand hall near the river. Evergreen boughs were arranged along railings and doorways, their scent mingling with candle smoke and sugar from sweet cakes. Music drifted through the space, careful and practiced, never loud enough to interrupt conversation. People moved like a measured tide, greeting one another, assessing, smiling. It was the sort of gathering that existed as much to be observed as to be enjoyed. I attended because it was expected. Nathaniel was there for the same reason. When we spoke, it was briefly, almost incidentally, a few sentences exchanged amid the larger movement of the room. Nothing in our words was remarkable. Nothing lingered on the surface. And yet, when we parted, I carried a quiet awareness with me, the sense that something unfinished had been left behind. After the hall emptied and the night returned to its softer silence, I imagined him at a desk, though I was not present to see it. I pictured paper laid out carefully, a pen held still for longer than necessary. It seemed to me that the paper already knew what he was about to attempt, that the words were waiting. Patient and unhurried, days passed. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived at my home. The envelope was thick, the handwriting elegant, the seal pressed cleanly, without hesitation. I read it in a quiet room where light fell across the floorboards in long, pale shapes. Even before I reached the end, I felt how he placed himself above me in the language of courtesy. Not cruelly. Almost unconsciously. As if kindness, when carefully phrased, could substitute for equality, I did not rush my reply. I waited until my thoughts had settled into clarity. When I wrote back, my tone was calm and deliberate. I refused to be treated as a problem that marriage might solve. I refused to be measured by rumor or age. I refused the idea that his interest was a favor bestowed rather than a meeting freely chosen. When his response came, it arrived sooner. An apology, carefully written. Not dramatic, not defensive. And then another letter followed. And another. Slowly, the correspondence shifted. The edges softened. The sentences grew less guarded. The exchange became less like a duel and more like a bridge laid plank by plank across distance. We began to notice one another in detail. I admitted my preference for truth over politeness. He admitted that restraint had been taught to him as virtue, and only now did he understand how easily restraint could become disguise. Time continued its steady movement around us, unchanged in appearance, while something quieter and more significant took shape beneath it. Spring eased itself into Savannah the way a quiet thought arrives, so gently that, at first, I could not say when it began. The air grew softer. Green returned to the trees in a shade that looked newly washed. Even the light changed, less sharp at the edges, as if it had learned to rest on things rather than strike them. Our letters continued through this shift in season, arriving with a steadiness that began to feel like a private clock. Marking time in ink instead of hours, I grew used to the small ceremony of receiving them. The sound of steps in the hall. The brief pause before the knock. The envelope placed carefully in my hand. There were days when I waited without admitting I waited, and other days when I told myself it did not matter, only to find my attention returning to the door again and again. I learned the weight of his handwriting on paper, the distinct shape of his strokes, the way his name looked as if it had been taught to stand upright. His words changed gradually. At first, he wrote as though he were addressing an audience, as though someone might be watching over his shoulder. Later, he wrote more plainly, with less performance. When he described the river at dusk, or the sound of rain against shutters, it felt as if he were allowing himself to be present in his own life. When he asked questions, they were no longer formal inquiries. They were genuine curiosities, as though he had begun to realize that knowing another person was not an accomplishment, but a practice. Then distance arrived, the sort that has nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with duty. Nathaniel had to travel north, then west, along the edges of business and expectation. His letters came from places I had never seen, carrying the names of towns that sounded like brief breaths. He wrote of train stations where coal smoke settled into clothing, of riverboats that moved with a heavy patience, of nights in rooms that did not feel like his own. He described streets made of dust, and mornings that began too early, and the particular loneliness of eating alone in public. I wrote back with steadiness at first, as though steadiness were protection. I spoke of home, of the city's slow return to warmth, of ordinary details that felt safe to hold. Yet, without meaning to, I began to place something softer between my lines. Not declarations. Not indulgence. Only tenderness shaped carefully, like a small lamp turned low. I did not fully trust it yet, but I did not hide it as completely as I once would have. And then, silence. It was not a dramatic silence. No argument preceded it. No farewell, no warning. The letters simply stopped. 1 week passed, then another. The absence grew noticeable, then heavy. I tried to be reasonable. Travel delays happened. Illness happened. Accidents of schedule happened. Still, I could not stop listening for the sound that had become part of my days. Rumors drifted in the way rumors always do, arriving disguised as concern. A cousin's letter mentioned a late night. A neighbor's friend claimed to have seen him entering a place that suggested temptation and poor judgment. Nothing was stated directly. Everything was implied, left to expand in the mind where it could do the most damage. I sat with the uncertainty like a weight on my chest. I told myself pride would keep me steady, yet pride did not prevent hope. I did not want to be haunted by maybes. At last, I wrote one final letter. I did not beg. I did not accuse. I only asked for honesty, because I would rather be hurt by truth than held captive by silence. Waiting has its own rhythm, slower than anticipation and heavier than hope. After I sent my final letter, the days did not move forward so much as they widened, stretching into long, quiet spaces that felt unfinished. I continued with my routines because routine was familiar and therefore manageable. I woke, dressed, ate, spoke when spoken to. Yet beneath those motions, my attention remained fixed on absence, on the quiet where words had been. Each morning, I listened for footsteps in the hall. Each afternoon, I noticed the light shift across the floorboards and wondered how many hours it had been since I last imagined his pen moving across a page. I did not allow myself to invent explanations. I did not allow myself to accuse. I simply waited, though waiting asked more of me than any answer might have. When his reply finally arrived, it did not come with ceremony. The envelope was plain. The handwriting familiar, yet altered, as if the hand behind it had learned something new. I carried it to my room and sat before opening it, allowing the moment to settle. Some truths require preparation, even when they are long desired. His letter was long. Not ornate, not guarded. It felt stripped of performance, written by someone who had grown tired of holding himself at a distance. He admitted his failures without dressing them in excuses. He confessed to being frightened by the depth of his feeling, unsettled by how quickly certainty had given way to vulnerability. He wrote that he had tried to outrun it, believing movement might restore control, and that he had failed. He explained the place whispered about in rumor. It was not a house of pleasure, but a place reached reluctantly, in pursuit of someone whose choices had drawn him into a humiliating scene he had hoped to resolve quietly. He did not claim innocence where it was not deserved. He only offered clarity, line by line, as if laying each fact carefully on the table and stepping back. What moved me most was not the explanation, but the way he wrote of himself. Without polish. Without defense. He spoke of devotion not as promise, but as intention, something that required daily honesty rather than grand declaration. He offered me what his world rarely rewarded, his unguarded self, imperfect and present. I read the letter slowly, as if each sentence needed to be placed carefully back into my body. I did not rush to forgiveness. I let the truth settle, testing its weight, its steadiness. I felt the shape of his sincerity, and I allowed myself to acknowledge it without surrendering caution. Weeks passed. Spring deepened into early summer. And then, quietly, we agreed to meet. Not with spectacle. Not with an audience. We chose Charleston Harbor, where the wind carried salt and the water held the sky in broken reflections. When I saw him there, he did not speak at once. He only stood, present and steady, allowing silence to do its work. There was no grand moment. No sweeping vow. Only the calm courage of beginning again, slowly, with eyes open, trusting that some truths arrive best when they are allowed to take their time. After that meeting, life did not suddenly transform itself. There was no sharp dividing line between before and after, no single moment that announced a conclusion. Instead, something softened, as though a tightly held breath had finally been released. We did not return immediately to the certainty others expected of us. We moved forward with care, allowing trust to rebuild at its own pace, guided less by hope than by attention, less by promise than by presence. Our correspondence resumed, though it felt quietly altered. The letters were no longer bridges thrown across absence, but extensions of something already rooted. We wrote not to explain ourselves, but to share the small textures of our days. He described harbor mornings, the way light broke across water before the city fully woke, the sound of rigging shifting in early wind. I wrote of Savannah evenings, of jasmine growing heavier with scent as summer approached, of streets that held warmth long after sunset. The words no longer felt urgent. They felt settled, as if they trusted they would be received. When we met again, it was without pretense. No crowded room. No careful audience. Just two people learning how to stand honestly in the same space. Conversation unfolded slowly, with pauses allowed to remain pauses. Silence no longer felt like something to be filled or corrected, but something to be trusted. We spoke of expectations. Of fear, of the quiet ways we had learned to protect ourselves from disappointment. Nothing was resolved all at once. Yet nothing felt hidden. I noticed how differently he listened now. Not with the intent to respond, but with the patience to understand. He allowed my words to arrive fully before answering, as though he had learned that listening itself could be an offering. And I recognized a change in myself as well. I no longer measured my words according to how they might be received or judged. I spoke as I was, and discovered that being heard did not require performance, only honesty, time continued its steady movement around us. Summer matured. The city adjusted its rhythm to heat and shade. Days unfolded with familiar rituals. Around us, the world remained much the same. Expectations persisted. Conversations repeated their practiced patterns. Yet within that continuity, something essential had shifted. We were no longer living entirely inside the roles we had been given. We were shaping something quieter, less visible, and more true, something that did not require constant defense. Years later, those letters would rest together in a small wooden box, lined with fabric that had faded into softness. The ink would lighten. The paper would thin at the folds where it had been opened and closed so many times. Yet the meaning would remain intact, carried forward not by preservation alone, but by memory and repetition. We would remember not just what was written, but how it felt to write it. I learned then that love does not always arrive like thunder. It does not always announce itself with certainty or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives like handwriting on a page, careful and deliberate. Sometimes it arrives as a truth finally spoken without defense. Sometimes it arrives as a willingness to remain present, again and again, even when retreat would feel safer. As the story settles, it does not end sharply. It only grows quieter, like a lamp turned low at the end of a long evening. The room does not empty. The warmth remains. Nothing more needs to be said. What mattered has already been written, and what remains now is rest, steady and unhurried. In the years that followed, the world continued in its steady turning, unconcerned with the quiet changes that had taken place within our lives. Days still opened into mornings. Evenings still found their way toward rest. Seasons moved as they always had, indifferent to individual stories, yet somehow shaped by them all the same. The letters remained. They rested together in a small wooden box, lined with fabric that had softened and faded with time. When the lid was lifted, the scent of paper and age rose gently, familiar and comforting. The ink had lost some of its darkness, settling into the page the way memories settle into the mind, not erased, only softened at the edges. The folds remembered how often they had been opened, how often they had been returned to waiting. I did not read them often. There was no need. Their meaning had long since moved beyond the page and into the quiet structure of daily life. Yet knowing they were there brought a particular calm, the assurance that something once chosen with care had been preserved, not as proof, but as presence. Life itself became less about explanation and more about rhythm. Shared mornings. Evenings that required no filling. Conversations that drifted easily into silence without discomfort. We learned that closeness did not demand constant expression. It thrived just as well in ordinary gestures, in attention given without request, in understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. What endured was not the drama of beginnings, nor the tension of uncertainty, but the steadiness that followed. The way trust, once earned, became something quiet and dependable. The way affection, when allowed to grow slowly, rooted itself deeply enough to weather time without strain. Looking back, I see now that the letters were never only about love between two people. They were about learning how to speak truth without urgency, how to listen without defense, how to allow meaning to unfold rather than be forced into shape. Ink did not shout. It waited. It rested on the page until it was ready to be understood. As night settles now, I allow the memory to grow still. There is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to explain. The story does not close with certainty, only with peace. The kind that arrives when effort is no longer required, when the body knows it can rest. The room feels quieter. Breathing slows. Thoughts loosen their grip and drift without direction. What remains is the simple reassurance that gentleness was enough. That patience carried its own reward. That when ink spoke softly, it did not fade. It stayed, steady and warm, like a final light left burning low, guiding the night gently towards sleep. Thank you for staying with me as we lingered among quiet letters, softened ink, and a love shaped by time rather than haste. If this story brought you comfort, you're welcome to like and subscribe for more gentle journeys through history, meant for the late hours. Rest now. Let the words fade like candlelight, keep a tender sense of remembrance, and allow the stillness of the 19th century to carry you into peaceful sleep.